Okay, in this chapter we're going to look at animal nutrition and the digestive system. Although we're going to look at some different animals, mainly we're going to focus on human because this is a good introduction to your anatomy and physiology course. So in this first slide we see some herbivores. They eat plants. Then we have carnivores that eat other animals. So a lion is not a surprise, but maybe a ladybug is a surprise as a carnivore. And then the omnivores like bear and crayfish, they eat plants and animals. Ultimately, we're all heterotrophs in the animal kingdom, and we all have extracellular digestion except for the sponges. And so no matter what we eat, we are heterotrophs. The fungi are also heterotrophs, and then we have the the organisms that are photosynthetic, plants, algae, cyanobacteria, those are photoautotrophs. But we're certainly going to be focusing on the animal heterotrophs in this chapter. So I need to give you kind of a big picture about the digestive system. The only reason you need food is that you need energy, and the way you get energy is by breaking down food, breaking down macromolecules, and there's sometimes many steps in that, but ultimately through cellular respiration to transfer the energy of the covalent bonds into ATP. So the energy of the covalent bonds of the food molecules is transferred into the energy in the bonds of ATP. And then your cell uses ATP for everything. So that's considered a source of energy. So that's really fundamental. The carbohydrates can be broken down and converted into glucose or some other similar monosaccharide, and that typically is going to be broken down by starting in glycolysis. But the fats, you remember fatty acids are long chains of hydrocarbons, and those can be broken down. So you have these long chains of carbon and hydrogen. You'll remember from your 1406 biology. And whether they're saturated or unsaturated, basically they're broken down into 2 carbon units, etc. And each 2 carbon unit can be converted into an acetyl-CoA. And you probably remember acetyl-CoA feeds into the Krebs cycle. And some of your, your amino acids some can be interconverted and some can be converted into things that are part of the Krebs cycle, like alpha-ketoglutarate is a key point. And that's in the Krebs cycle. You don't have to memorize that, but the amino acids are typically converted into things that can be fed into the Krebs cycle. So all of your food can be converted into something that can be fed into one of the parts of cellular respiration, ultimately to make ATP. The other thing that you need food for is to create monomers. So when you eat protein, your body breaks down the peptide bonds between the amino acids, and then it keeps those amino acids, and when it needs to build a protein, it just grabs those, and the ribosome builds a protein from those amino acids. So when you rebuild human proteins, you're using the amino acids that you got from plant proteins or another animal's proteins. So your body breaks them down to the monomer point, but then it reuses those, it recycles those to build the human proteins, for example. Same thing for building glycogen, which is a storage form of sugar. Same thing for fats. So your body can partially break down your food and then recycle some of those components. So those are really your 2 functions. It's either your food is either going to be completely oxidized to make ATP, or it's going to be partially broken down and then the monomers will be recycled to make other biomolecules which build the structures of your cells. So we looked at in the periphery, the sponges, and also single-celled organisms, although those are not animals. But the sponges are animals that digest their food intracellularly. So that means that a food vacuole is formed that brings in a large macromolecule, and then the lysosome fuses with that food vacuole, mixes the food with the hydrolytic enzymes that are in the food vacuole. Those hydrolytic enzymes break down the food into the monomers only. And then those monomers are released into the cytosol. Now, whether or not those monomers eventually get completely oxidized by cellular respiration or whether they get picked up and built into larger macromolecules, it just depends. So one of those two things will be the fate of those molecules. But other multicellular animals first digest their food extracellularly and then bring them into the cell. Extracellularly means there's an opening, a digestive cavity, which there's a tissue that forms the lining of the digestive cavity that secretes hydrolytic enzymes into that space. And so this is happening not inside of a cell, but it's the same type of reactions. It's hydrolysis reactions, but they're happening outside the cell. And then once the monomer units are produced, they can be then passed into the cells. So one way or another, monomer units end up inside the cells so that the cell can use them either for energy through respiration or for building other molecules. And you'll remember the cnidarians and the flatworms have what we call a gastrovascular cavity, which means they really only have a mouth that leads to some kind of single space, no matter what the shape is. The food goes in, the lining of this cavity secretes enzymes into the space, the molecules are broken down. Anything that can be absorbed is absorbed. Anything that can't be broken down goes back out the mouth. So there aren't any specialized regions of the digestive systems in the cnidarians and flatworms. There's just this one structure called the gastrovascular cavity. All right, but for most other organisms, there are specialized sections of the digestive system. And this can happen in different ways. I think at this point you've seen enough diversity that you can understand that not everything works exactly like it works in humans. But generally speaking, there has to be at some point in the digestive process a physical fragmentation of the food. For animals with jaws, we chew it up at the beginning, and that breaks it up into a mush. And there are some animals, though, that swallow things whole, and then it gets broken down later, physically crushed. But typically there has to be some kind of physical fragmentation before or after the movement of the food further down into the body. But at some point then there's chemical digestion. So that's hydrolysis reactions, which you'll recall from 1406 biology. So the hydrolytic enzymes break the glycosidic bonds that exist in carbohydrates. They break the peptide bonds that exist in proteins. They break the ester bonds that exist in fats and such. And the products of those hydrolysis reactions actually move into the one face of the epithelial cells. And there is a simple epithelium that lines the digestive system, so it's a single layer. The monomers have to go into those cells and then out the other side. So they actually go through the epithelial cells. And so when the monomers pass through the epithelial cells, we call that absorption. And what is on the other side of the epithelium is the blood vessel, the circulatory system. Now, the food continues, any food that's not absorbed continues through the alimentary canal, which is the tube that goes from the mouth to the anus. And anything that cannot be chemically digested or absorbed goes all the way through the alimentary canal and comes out the anus. So those are truly wastes, things that animal cannot utilize. So with certain animals, you start to see in evolution what we call a specialization of the digestive system. And one of the simplest ones is in the nematode worm. The nematode has a mouth, no jaw, and basically one long intestine that has an epithelial membrane, the simple epithelium, and at the other end an anus. But the most important thing is that the epithelium secretes the enzymes needed to break down the food. So food comes in the mouth. If it can be broken down to a small enough size, then it'll be passed across the simple epithelium into the body. Otherwise, the waste comes out the anus. So we call it a complete digestive system when there's a separate mouth and anus, because that means that the food moves through the system in a unidirectional way. So in general, the tube that goes from the mouth to the anus, the path of food, is, in general, that series of tubes or series of structures is called the alimentary canal. So up here we see an incomplete digestion with the cnidarians, for example. They only have a mouth but no anus, and they don't have any specialized structures really, just one. But with the nematode, you see some of the very simplest of the complete digestive system. They have a pharynx, which is the space behind the mouth in this case. And then they have the intestine. So the intestine epithelium secretes those enzymes which hydrolyzes the macromolecules into monomers, and then those can be absorbed. Anything that doesn't get absorbed continues moving forward unidirectionally and comes out the anus. We call it feces, waste. So, of course, I knew there had to be a joke somewhere, because alimentary canal, I don't know, it's just kind of funny, so I found this. What makes you think the key to his poisoning is in the digestive tract? It's alimentary, my dear Watson. And the doctor says, get out. All right, now let's look at monogastric systems. Monogastric systems, that means one stomach. And here's the human stomach here. This side of the human stomach is called the greater curvature. This side of the human stomach is called the lesser curvature. But there's only one stomach. And the stomach is really more of a holding place. I know people think that, all the digestion happens in the stomach. Actually, only some of the digestion happens in the stomach and none of the absorption. So there's no absorption really of any nutrients in the stomach. The stomach is actually covered on the inside with mucus, and so it's really not possible for it to absorb too much. Although, interestingly, what does get absorbed is drugs. Typically, drugs will be absorbed through or pass over the stomach epithelium, but most of your nutrients are not going to be absorbed until they get to the first part of the small intestine. So there's a difference between digestion. Digestion just means hydrolysis, but absorption means moving from the alimentary canal across the epithelium into the blood. So you first digestion, then absorption. If you have digestion without absorption, then that's completely useless. So a rabbit has a single stomach. Interesting thing about rabbits, though, is they have, and I have some rabbits, so this is true, they put out these little tiny feces that then they have to eat again, and then when it goes through the second time, it absorbs more of the nutrients, and then it puts out the larger little round feces. So they're kind of interesting, but they're still a single stomach, so monogastric, single stomach. When you look at the anatomy and the physiology of the rabbit versus the human, very similar. One thing that's different is this little dead end pouch here, cecum and appendix. This is appendix here. The rabbit has it, and a lot of animals have a bigger cecum than we have, an appendix. But the food actually kind of bypasses that as it goes through out to the anus. You'll see that in your lab. Birds, though, birds don't chew their food, so they actually have kind of two stomachs. If we think of a stomach as just kind of a holding organ, the crop and the gizzard. The crop is kind of a floppy, kind of a not muscular sac, and the food comes in, and the bird just swallows it whole. And then it moves down into the gizzard. The gizzard is full of muscle, and it really grinds the food. So because the bird doesn't have teeth, the grinding has to happen a little bit later on. But then it moves into the small intestine where the digestion and the absorption are going to happen. Most birds will swallow rocks to help the gizzard as it's moving around. The muscular action helps to grind with the rocks in there. Then you have something like this. A ruminant animal has 4 stomachs. Now, what do we mean by 4 stomachs? 4 sections of the digestion that all kind of serve the purpose of kind of holding the material, not really absorbing anything. And that's what we mean typically by stomachs. They're not all called stomach, though. You have the rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum. But you don't have to know the names. But the food goes in, it usually comes back up, the animal regurgitates, swallows again, and it's actually a little bit reminiscent of the rabbit, although the rabbit lets the feces form all the way and then eats it again. But this concept of kind of passing things through twice is not that unusual in the animal kingdom. Now, one thing that exists in animals that eat grass, and you probably remember, we looked at some of the jaw bones of animals that eat grass, the artiodactyls, which have the molars, the goat and the cow. I think we looked at their jaw bones. So you will remember they have these molars, these flat teeth for grinding plants. And really no animal has enzymes to break down cellulose. So cellulose is the main structure of the plant cell wall, and it's made up of glucose, but we don't have the enzymes to break down those beta-glycosidic linkages. And so but these animals have a symbiotic relationship with certain prokaryotes and protists, which we do as well, but these animals have prokaryotes and protists that can actually break down the cellulose into glucose. So when one of these animals eats grass, it actually raises their blood sugar. When you eat grass, it doesn't raise your blood sugar. It'll just pass through the alimentary canal and come out the other end, probably in an unpleasant way. But for these animals, they'll gain weight when they eat grass because the cellulose can be broken down into the individual glucose units. And for you, it cannot. All right, I'm going to take a break here. We'll pick this up on the next lecture segment.